Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, Barter Hordes. My name is Robert. Happy May 1st, May Day. I'd like to wish Kendra Winchester a happy 30th birthday today. Kendra, as some of you already know, is the first booktuber I met in person. Even before I started my channel a couple of years ago, I stopped by her hometown near Greenville on my way back and forth between Florida and North Carolina when I was moving up here to meet her and talk about my plans for a book prize and my possible plans for a channel. And she gave me a lot of good feedback, and we've been in contact ever since. So happy birthday, Kendra. Another decade birthday baby. This has been a pretty productive week for me. I'll start you off with the things that I've been watching. As you know, if you followed my channel recently, I've been binge watching all 6.5 seasons of The Sopranos, and I finished that series towards the beginning of the week and then had an immediate television hangover. It was such an immersive series that I hated to see it end, and of course the ending has been very controversial, and I didn't know that was coming, so I got to experience it like everybody who saw it live when it was first released. But then I didn't know what else to watch, and so I found out that at the beginning of this week the 4th season of The Last Kingdom was being released on Netflix, and I have watched the first 3 seasons of that. And so I binge watched those 10 episodes this week and finished those last night, as a matter of fact. And as much as I enjoy doing that, I really prefer watching a series that's already stopped production so I can watch the entire series in one relatively short period of time. Watching a season and then waiting 6 to 9 months for the next season to drop, I tend to forget all the details, and so I might as well just go back and start watching it all over again once it's finished. And so the first 2 or 3 episodes of this season of The Last Kingdom, I'm trying to remember who's this character, what's his role, what's her role. I still enjoyed it, but I would enjoy it a lot more if I watched it in sequence all at one time. And so now I'm in the same bind I was last week. What do I watch next? There is a new series on Netflix that I think I'll give a try. Again, it's a series that may be ongoing. I don't know if there's going to be a season 2 or not, but it's called The English Game, which is about the early history of what we call in America soccer, what they call, the rest of the world calls football. And as that is my favorite sport, and I'm a huge fan of the English soccer leagues, the English Premier League especially, I'm anxious to see what they've done with that. And so I'll probably start watching that next and then wonder if there'll be a season 2. Several of you gave me some good suggestions last week that I'm going to start researching. I've seen most of the really popular shows, apparently. I've seen The Wire, I've seen The West Wing, I've seen Breaking Bad. And so I'm starting to look for some slightly less well-known series, I guess. I'm not a huge TV connoisseur or consumer, but I do enjoy a good binge watch. In terms of my film project, my AFI film project, I watched another one this week. I watched the 1976 film Network with Faye Dunaway and Robert Duvall. And it was interesting. I can't say I really loved it. It was interesting in the sense that it almost predicts the way news now has turned into a ratings-driven business rather than an actual news division. And of course, it's a satire. But I think some of our news divisions, and I won't name any of them, Fox News, took this as a playbook rather than as a satire, and they've developed their news division based on these guidelines. And in that way, it's really kind of a interesting watch at this particular time. But I can't say I really enjoyed it. To me, it seemed it was overwritten, it was overacted. It's very much like other films that I've seen from the 1970s, which I also thought I was going to enjoy a whole lot more than I actually did. It's just something about the style of the films from the 1970s where the dialogue goes really fast, but it's not really very convincing. It doesn't feel very authentic or real. Starting in the 80s and 90s, I felt like movies became more realistic. And I am not a film buff by any means, so I'm sure there are going to be people who think that's a ridiculous comment, but that's just based on what I've seen. So I've seen 16 now of the AFI 100 films from their 10th anniversary list. The 17th one that came up in my random generator is the 1982 film Sophie's Choice, which I have seen before, but it's been a long time, and I'm a huge World War II reader and watcher anyway, so I am looking forward to that, although of course it's a horribly emotional film to watch, but that's the one I'll be watching next for my film project. In terms of my reading, I finished 2 books this week. I have 2 more that are nearly finished and one that I'll be starting later today, so I'll take you through those relatively quickly. If you've watched my videos over the last several weeks, you know that I've been reading a lot of nonfiction, especially social activism or social justice nonfiction. And that can really wear on you after a while because they're all super important. They're important books to read and to talk about, but reading a lot of them in sequence just really takes a toll. And I think I've experienced that a little bit. And that especially hit home with the first book that I finished this week, which was No Visible Bruises by Rachel Louise Snyder. It's about domestic violence, a term that she doesn't really like, but it's the one that is in use the most. And she takes you through not only a history of domestic violence in America, but kind of a survey of all the different things that government agencies, law enforcement agencies, charitable agencies have all tried to do to support people who have been caught in a domestic abusive relationship, and also to try to prevent them from escalating to a homicide, which of course is one of the leading causes of death, especially for women in the United States, is a homicide as a result of an escalated domestic abuse situation. And it's a really well done book, but it put me into a little bit of a reading slump because it was just too much after some of the other ones that I've read. Had I read this one more slowly, and had I read it not surrounded by so many other social justice books, this one would have stood out to me as a terrific book. And so it's through no fault of the book that I had a rough reading experience with this particular one. And it's also really interesting because the second book that I finished just last night is related to No Visible Bruises, and that is Stephanie Land's book, Maid, which is a memoir about her own experience coming out of a relationship that was abusive, going into a homeless shelter with her young daughter, and being in systemic poverty that was virtually impossible for her to break out of for years. Many years ago, I read Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dimed, where she was trying to talk about the cycle of poverty and how impossible it is for some people to make a living at the wages they're paid if they don't have other opportunities. And she worked as a maid in a hotel, things like that. But for Barbara Ehrenreich, it was just a social experiment. When she got in trouble financially, she just pulled out a credit card and bailed herself out for the sake of her project. Stephanie Land didn't have that as an option. She was living this nightmare, and it wasn't just an experiment for her. So this book, to me, feels more authentic than Nickel and Dimed did. And it's a heart-wrenching story. Every time she would start to get on her feet, something would happen to knock her back down again through no fault of her own. And it's just a really brutal story of what it's like for somebody who's trying to do everything right and cannot win. It takes her a good 4 or 5 years before she finally works herself out of the cycle of poverty. And it's really a fascinating read. She is also a creative writer. She went to school in creative writing once she finally got out of this cycle of poverty. And you can tell she's a really good writer. And this memoir is one I highly recommend, even though it's another one that is, going to rip your soul out at times. It's really worth reading. The two that I have in progress and that I'm close to finishing, one is a novel, Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, and the other is nonfiction, The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. And I don't want to say too much about them while I'm still reading them. I'll save that for next week when I finish them. I know Lost Children Archive, however, has a very divided response among critics and booktubers. Some people that I've talked to lay claim to it as their favorite book, the best written book they've read in years. Other booktubers I've talked to couldn't finish it because they hated it so much. I'm in between those two poles, but I am leaning more towards the non-fans than towards the fans of this book. I have really had some problems with it and have not really enjoyed it. I am probably 100 pages from the end, and so I'll finish it this weekend. I'll talk about it in more detail next week. The other one, The Yellow House, is another memoir. It's nonfiction about Sarah Broom's growing up in East New Orleans as the youngest of 12 siblings to a widow. Her father, Sarah Broom's father, dies when she's relatively young, and she is number 12 of the children. A couple of the children are from her father's first marriage, and so her mother didn't give birth to all 12, but she raised all 12. And it's about a house they lived in East New Orleans, a community that should never have been allowed to be built anyway because it was in a floodplain between two bodies of water, and how the house was always in disrepair, always falling down, no matter what they tried to do to keep it up. And the first part of the book is really kind of a history of her family, which can get really confusing because there are lots of characters, as you can imagine, with 11 siblings, plus uncles and aunts and cousins and friends. It's a little hard to follow at the beginning. But then as you get into part 3, it's really a history of what Hurricane Katrina does to this family. And it's funny because she doesn't really refer to it as Katrina much. She refers to it as the water, as in before the water and after the water. And of course, Katrina hit in 2005, I believe. And that is where I am now in the Katrina section, the after the water section. And I'm really enjoying it because I've started to figure out who all the people are and how their lives intertwine. It's also very well written. This one reminds me a lot of In the Country of Women by Susan Straight, where it's a history of a family, but it's hard to follow the family tree, so to speak, because there's so many people involved. But I think it's very well done. And I'll talk about that a little bit more next week. And then the one I'm about to start, I didn't read one of my Louise Penny books in April. Somehow April got by me and I didn't read one. I've been trying to read one a month. And so I'm going to start one today, and then if I have time at the end of May, sneak in another one so I get back on track. But I'm about to start reading the one called How the Light Gets In. And I forget what number this is, 8, 9, 10, something like that in the series. I'm somewhere between a half and 2/3 of the way through her series so far. So that's what I've been reading. I've been listening to a ton of classical music this week. I told you I was going to get back involved with my classical music project soon, and I've listed all the works I listened to this week in the description box below. And of course, there's a link there also to the now exploding in size playlist on Apple Music that I have been putting together. As I listen to a work, I add it to that playlist, and that playlist is getting longer and longer. The one work I want to feature is by an American composer that I have not featured yet in this series, but he is one of my favorite composers, and that's Aaron Copland. And this is the suite of music from his ballet, Appalachian Spring. And the suite was compiled or edited or put together in 1945. And the recording that I have featured is I think it's a 1989 recording by the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, an organization that's based in New York City. They play in Carnegie Hall. And what's interesting about the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra is they don't have a full-time conductor. They are basically a musician-led organization. They make all the decisions as an ensemble about what they're going to do and how they're going to perform it. This piece is one that's very different from the big, loud, romantic symphonies that I often feature and love. This is an extremely quiet, contemplative piece, a bit of Americana. You'll recognize various tunes in there from other aspects of American music. It's about 25 minutes long. It's slow in some places, but it is just one of the most gorgeous pieces out there. And the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra is just stellar in their interpretation and performance on this particular recording. So if you don't know the suite from Appalachian Spring, give it a listen. It's simply gorgeous music. Okay, I think that's everything that I meant to cover today. I hope you have a great weekend and that you're staying safe and sane and busy either with new projects or reading great books or whatever it is that you're doing to pass the time. And I'll talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.